I'm going to give it just another minute here as I see quite a few people logging in. We'll get started in just a minute here. Okay, I think we'll get started today. Firstly, on behalf of ICCT, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm Joanna Cook, the Editor-in-Chief of the ICCT Journal. Today, you'll get a sneak peek of the extensive forthcoming report, a comparative study of non-state violent drone use in the Middle East by Yannick Veilleux-Lepage and Emil Archambault. I've had a chance to see a pre-release version of this report, and I can tell you that across over the 90 pages and the 5 case studies they've produced, an incredibly rich overview of some non-state actors we may be used to seeing a little bit more on, such as Islamic State, and others which have not been reviewed as extensively, such as the Houthis. Yet the comparative element of this report and the new and updated detail around the cases make it a particularly valuable and rich piece of research. Before I hand it over and introduce our speakers today, I want to briefly introduce the International Center for Counter-Terrorism to those who are less familiar with our work. ICCT is an independent think and do tank based in The Hague, working to provide research, evidence-based policy, advice, and practical on-the-ground solutions on matters regarding counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. We also have a special focus on prevention and the rule of law. Now, to introduce you to our speakers today, I'll first introduce Yannick Veilleux-Lepage, a colleague of mine at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University, where he's an assistant professor of terrorism and political violence. Yannick holds a doctorate in international relations from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Emil Archambault is a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, Canada, and a visiting researcher at ISCA at Leiden University as well, having completed his doctorate at the University of Durham in 2021. They've both researched and published extensively on this topic and other related subjects, and I highly encourage you to follow their work. So before we hand it over to them, a few housekeeping notes to keep this session today running smoothly. First, I will hand it over to them where they will speak for approximately 45 minutes. And we will have a question and answer period afterwards. If you would like to ask a question, you can feel free to start submitting them at any time during the briefing using the Zoom Q&A feature. Please do identify yourself and your affiliation. I will try and answer as many questions as I can, so please do keep the questions clear and concise as well. Please also note that a recording of the briefing will be made available to all registered participants on the ICCT YouTube channel. Finally, please help us improve future live briefings by completing a very short post-event survey that will pop up on your screen when you leave this briefing. Without further ado, Yannick, Emil, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joanna, for this kind introduction. I'd like to start by taking a minute to acknowledge our funders, the Canadian Department of National Defence Mine Targeted Engagement Grant Program, which allowed us to conduct this research. I'd also like to take a moment to thank ICCT for generously taking the time to edit the report and later on to disseminate the report, but also for organizing this webinar. And also thank you for all the attendees for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and hear about some of the exciting research that we are doing here at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. Now, as essentially a bit of a starting point, I'd like to start with the bottom line up front that is laid out in the report, which is essentially the main three arguments that we bring forward. Firstly, that looking at various violent non-state actors in the Middle East and how they use drone technology, what we see is a substantial amount of variation in the usage of the system. And this seems to be quite dependent on particular groups, specific, geographic and political situation. This is one of the themes that we are going to explore further in this presentation, is the fact that this is not a one-size-fit-all problem. We see a great deal of variation both in the scope of the programs, but also in the usage of these drones. Secondly, the second main argument that we bring forward here is the notion that drone programs present a significant threat to state actors, and more attention needs to be devoted to understanding how non-state actors innovate and use drone technology. And lastly, we're going to argue that an empirical record of drone use doesn't necessarily match prediction that we've seen in the literature about the threat itself. So what I mean by this is that we've done an extensive survey of the various way that non-state actors can use drones and the various scenarios that are brought forward in the existing literature. And we're seeing substantial difference once we actually look at the reality on the ground. We're going to hash that out a bit more up front. Now, as a means of introduction, if you'll allow me to spend a few minutes to walk through a brief timeline of violent non-state actors' use of drone technology kind of in a global setting. In our survey of existing cases in the literature, one of the things that we've found is that this threat is by no means a brand new threat, nor is it necessarily an emerging threat. In fact, we found the first instance of a plot involving drone-like technology is nearly 50 years old. In 1971, there was a plot by the Jewish Defense League to attack Soviet interests in the United States using remote control helicopters. One of I'd say the most salient example of the longevity of drone threats actually comes from 1994. In the aftermath of Rikyo's attack on the Tokyo subway, so the sarin agent attack, there was a substantial amount of literature that emerged arguing, or at the very least bring forward the contention that Rikyo had experimented with drone technology as a delivery mechanism for sarin agent. And this remains in many ways the starting point in a great deal of the literature that we have reviewed. But we would also argue that the actual evidence for this claim are not necessarily as strong as what is often being portrayed. So we raised questions in our report as to whether or not this plot was quite as developed as it is often laid out in the literature. And I think this brings back one of the main arguments that we make in the report, which is often the perception of drone threats doesn't necessarily match the reality that we see on the ground. We'll talk about this a bit forward. The next main development that we see is an intense period after the September 11, 2001 attack, where we see several instances which we lay out in the report, of disrupted drone plots by a variety of agents, but often by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda affiliates. Now, one of the things that we find quite interesting here as well is that while these plots are often reported in the existing literature, once we dive deeply in these plots, we start realizing that many of them were simply unrealistic as far as what the plot was supposed to entail based on the technology that was available at the time. And more importantly, very few of these reported plot resulted in any type of successful prosecution. I think one of the rare cases here is an example in 2003 where LET operatives were arrested and convicted of attempting to buy UAV parts on behalf of the Pakistani LET. But apart from that, what we see is a certain exaggeration of the capacity of drones to engage or being used in order to conduct terrorist attack during this kind of post 9/11 period. So again, I think it brings back the point that empirical research here is quite important. Now, where we start seeing the emergence of drone program by non-state actors in 2004. So Hezbollah has had a long relationship with UAV. So as early as 1997, they were actively intercepting Israeli UAV feeds and using that in order to conduct counter operations. But as early as 2004, they started fielding drones over Israeli airspace. In 2006, we have the first case of a Hezbollah weaponized drone. And in a particularly worrying incident in 2016, Hezbollah was able to fly a drone near an Israeli nuclear reactor. So we see how quickly from 2004 onwards, how quickly this technology is being adopted and utilized by Hezbollah. Now, 2015, we start seeing the apparition of drones within the arsenal, if you will, of the Islamic State, first being used as a mean of reconnaissance, but also in the production of propaganda by the group itself. The following years, 2016, we see the emergence of weaponized drones, both by groups like Hezbollah, but also the PKK. And we're going to talk more extensively as to what we mean by weaponized drones shortly. And from the emergence of the Hezbollah and PKK somewhat rudimentary weaponized drones by 2019, Houthi forces are using drones as form of loitering munition, particularly in a fairly striking or salient incidents, which involved targeting a Yemeni army parade. And to also kind of illustrate the fact that the notion of commercial and military drones being used in conflict zone is not limited to the Middle East. I think it's worth pointing out that in recent months, we have seen both Ukrainian military forces using both civilian and military drones in the conflict. And we've also seen the deployment of Iranian-made drones by the Russian army in Ukraine. So really, in many ways, and we're going to talk about this in a bit further, but the technological development that's happened in the Middle East seem to have a much more important global impact. So as far as what we sought to do in this particular report, we were driven by four main research questions. Firstly, we were interested in understanding how do various non-state groups employ drone violently in the Middle East. So what is the reality on the ground, if you will? Secondly, we wanted to look at how these groups develop drone technology and how this technology might be diffused both between states and non-state actors, but also amongst allied non-state actors. The third main question that we focused on was what were the factors that might push, if you will, or influence the decision by a non-state actor to start employ drone violently. And then lastly, for the policymakers amongst us, what are the challenges that this proliferation of non-state violent drone presents to military forces and security forces that are engaging in operations in the Middle East? So our starting point to answer this question was the creation of a typology, which was based on some of the groundbreaking work that Dan Rassler had done in 2016, but also supplemented by a wide survey of the existing literature. And in this typology, we set out essentially 5 ways that drones might be used by non-state actors. So the first one dealing with the notion of surveillance, which involved things like doing reconnaissance, but also collecting electronic intelligence to providing operational support on the ground. The second category that we identified was the notion of external communication. So drones being used as a mean of providing messages, so essentially as courier drones, but also the importance of drone in the recording and creation of via non-state actor propaganda. The third category that we identified from the literature revolved around smuggling and internal communication. So essentially the notion that drones could facilitate access to protected facilities or could be used to facilitate logistical and supply chain. We've also identified several cases in the literature of disruption. These were generally done not quite by violent non-state actors, but largely by activists. But for example, harassing public figures, creating fake threats. So here we can think, for example, disruptions around the Gatwick Airport in 2018, if I remember correctly, drone being used as a mean of vandalism or to interfere with other systems. And then the last way that we've seen drones being conceptualized as being used by violent non-state actors had to do with this notion of pilot to target. So essentially weaponizing drones by adding by adding an explosive payload and then piloting the drone into a particular target. Drones being used as a means of delivering weapons of mass destruction, either chemical or biological or radioactive weapons. Explosive delivery, so the notion of a drone being used to drop an ordnance onto a particular target. And then lastly, this question of weapon mount, so essentially drones being equipped with a firearm and which is remotely activated. And this is essentially kind of all the scenarios that we've seen both in reality but also in the literature out there. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about what bears out in the empirical record and what hasn't been manifested. So what we decided to set as the parameters for this research was essentially to focus not only on individual instances of drone use, but instead to look at groups that had what we define or what we call a significant drone program. And what we mean by this is a frequent use of drone as part of their operation, their arsenal, a sustained development of both medium and long-term infrastructure, and also a demonstrated technical and tactical innovation in their use of drones. So essentially, we are not interested in the groups that have used drones on a handful of occasions. Really, we wanted to focus on groups that had adopted drones kind of wholeheartedly as part of their arsenal. And in the Middle East, we identified 5 of these groups: the Islamic State, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi rebels, and the PKK. Now, in order to go about this project, essentially what we started off doing was creating a codebook based on an extensive survey of the literature. This codebook then allowed us to create a granular incident databases of instances in which drones were used by violent non-state actors. And this database was populated by both using international media reports coming from think tanks and NGOs, such as like the Armin Research Group, existing data sets like the global terrorism databases, but also one of the aspects that was quite important with this project is that we recruited a talented team of research assistants that had native language speaking skills in Arabic, Turkish, Hebrew, French, English, and so on. And we've asked them to survey both the propaganda that was being released by these groups, but also local media reports. So it was quite important for us to try to get as much empirical data that was reflecting realities on the ground. Now, using these incident data sets, we were able to do two things. One is create these 5 extensive case studies, but also to build inductively theories that would allow us to understand how drone use takes place. So this is just kind of one example of the many entries within our databases and some of the variables that we were interested in for every incident. So the dates, the location in which the incident took place, a summary of the incident itself, the make and model of the drone when available, the type of incidents based on the typology that we've presented briefly, the target, whether it appeared like an experimental use or it was part of a developed approach, the impact, the information on internal decision-making process, if available, how the drone itself was obtained, whether a subgroup was responsible, and any other relevant information along with the source itself. Now, the database itself is quite extensive. We have 654 entries. Now, this does not necessarily mean that there's been 654 incidents of drone use in the Middle East. We believe it's much more than this, but nonetheless, I think it gives us a very clear snapshot of the various ways that this technology is being used. So as far as a breakdown of cases, Islamic State and Houthi forces make I'd say the large sum of it, but we also have a good sample of cases by Hezbollah, Hamas, and the PKK. Now, with that, I'm going to cede the floor to my co-author, who's going to talk about some of the core arguments that we present in the report.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks again for being here for this webinar. What I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so now is walk through the 3 main arguments that we are making in this report about how groups employ drones and how they build their programs. So these are the 3 arguments that Yannick mentioned at the beginning. We're looking at the pathways of development. How do they develop their drone programs? We're looking at the use of drones. What do these groups try to do with these drones? And then in the end, as Yannick mentioned, I will come back and look, how does this actual development and use of drones stack up against what is expected in the literature and where most academic and policy analysts put the weight of their efforts, whether that matches or not. So to start with the first one here, what I want to argue in the next few minutes, in the next few slides, is that we see a lot of variation between these groups. So we're focusing here on 5 groups in this report. That's also 5 pathways of development. In the last few years, as the Islamic State case was very prevalent and they released a lot of propaganda, we sometimes saw arguments that they clearly provide the blueprint. Other groups try to do something similar to the Islamic State, and they either succeed partially or they fail, and that other groups that come in the future would try to basically do what the Islamic State did. What we show here is that that's not the case. Groups have different pathways different ways to develop their programs, depending on a variety of group-specific factors that are important to understand. And that includes the organizational culture. Groups are built differently and do different things. And or organized differently, whether there's a state patron that can help them out or not. The time constraints, some groups such as Hezbollah have a lot of time to build their program over several years. So Yannick mentioned that Hezbollah flew their first drone in 2004. Other groups such as ISIS or the Islamic State have to build it on the fly under time pressure while engaged in combat. That shapes how they will do it. And finally, whether the group controls territory or not. That also plays again with the urgency and whether they have time to experiment. So I can just get the slide to move in a second. Well, there we are. As mentioned, so each group has their own pathways of development, and within each group as well, pathways are not always linear. Sometimes we will see groups starting to do one thing and then switch over to another model. That includes things such as Hezbollah, for instance, beginning by flying large drones, often received from Iran, and then after a bit, starting when they need much more drones, to start using commercial drones that they modify, and so on. Groups will change their structure and change how they use drones. So we're not trying, even if we're sort of flying over a group as an ensemble here, there is a lot of variation within groups as well, which is important to remember. So coming to the group, to organizational structure and the presence of state patrons first. It is important to mention that each group engages in independent development, even if they have a state patron. It's not the case that these groups only are past recipients of material and knowledge and so on from states or from other groups. Each group develops on their own. That, of course, comes to different degrees. A group such as Hezbollah will have a network of supporters abroad that it can rely on to try to obtain drones and try to support its drone program. And there have been evidence of Hezbollah supporters in the United States, for instance, being arrested and prosecuted for trying to smuggle drone material to Hezbollah. Other groups such as IS, the Islamic State, of course, does not rely on a patron. Therefore, they have to build up their own structure. In the case of the Islamic State, what we see is that the group, in pretty much all of its activities, not only having to do with drones, try to impose a very centralized and very rigid or sort of comprehensive structure that would allow it to have routine procedures and well-established administrative chains of command. What you see here on the right side of the screen is taken from a report by Asad Al-Mohammad and Anne Speckhardt from ICSVE on the ISIS drone program. And what they identified is that the Islamic State had several centers where they would receive drones, and then there would be another center that would be in charge of modifying them, another for armament, and they would have drone schools that would then be used to train pilots and operators. So we see a very organized structure within the group to try to impose centralized and standardized procedure. Now, in the case of Islamic State, that worked to a certain extent. We see several similarities in munition design, for instance, in certain regions, but we also see, and this is work by Nick Waters at Bellingcat that showed that we still see variations between regions, that Islamic State in Syria, for instance, used different munition design than many of the Islamic State units in Iraq. So that standardization worked to a certain extent, but not completely. Other groups, such as the Kurdish PKK, also did not necessarily have an established state patron. However, there have been allegations, mainly by Turkish authorities, that the PKK recuperated munitions and material from its affiliated group that was collaborating with the Worldwide Coalition Against ISIS, so that there might be an indirect patronage link there, where they would receive material from other powers. But the PKK as well has had to build up its program largely by itself without necessarily being able to rely on an external source. However, as that being said, all groups, as mentioned, maintain external links, and it's not the case that any of them try to become passive recipients for a state's material and assistance. The major group here, of course, the major state, when we talk about a state patron in the Middle East, is, of course, Iran. That has links with many of the groups at study here in the report, at least 3 of them, namely Hamas, the Houthi movement, and Hezbollah. What we see in this assistance from Iran to these groups, we see certain similarities between them. For instance, all 3 of these groups fly Ababil model drones under different names. So we see similar models of drones, similar equipment showing up. That's not always the case. Houthi forces have access to certain drone models, Samad models, for instance, that we do not necessarily see Hezbollah and Hamas use, and vice versa. There's been an argument made by Afshan Afstovar, for instance, that a big difference between them is that Hamas also does not have access to a sort of stable territory, which Hezbollah and the Houthi movement enjoy, which also facilitates relations with Iran in that case. Another aspect of what we see coming between these groups is there's an intergroup training and collaboration. So Hezbollah, for instance, has publicly announced that they donated funds to the Houthi movement to purchase drones. And there's been reports also of Houthi movement forces collaborating with Hezbollah and receiving training from Hezbollah units on the use of drones. So what we see is that it's not simply direct links from a patron Iran to these groups, but also links between these groups that matter. And I'll come to the role of the militias in Iraq a bit later. They don't form a full case study in our report, but they remain important operationally, and I'll come to that in a second section later on. The other major characteristic in establishing differences between these groups, as I mentioned, had to do with timescales and with territory. And here we see a graph that shows sort of the length of these drone programs. Hezbollah has been using drones for much longer than any other of these groups, and that also shapes how they use them. Some groups, such as Hezbollah or Hamas, have a very sort of simmering drone program, where you will have episodic attacks, then you will have a lull. For instance, I believe Hezbollah did not fly any drones towards Israel between 2007 and 2012, if I remember well. And then it will pick up again, and it will be very sort of low intensity, but continued throughout time. Other groups, such as the Islamic State, will have a drone program that is established for a very short period of time, much like the group's claimed caliphate or territorial unit existed only for a fairly short period of time. However, that also means that it's a very high tempo of operation, that drone activity takes place at a much more intense rate, and you might have several attacks a week or even a day. In the last battles against ISIS, against the Islamic State, for instance, in Mosul, you could have a large number of drones in the air at any given time, which made operations very complicated for the coalition combating them. That is a very different dynamic than, for instance, Israel trying to counter the threat from Hamas or Hezbollah. One major factor in differentiating that as well is the presence of a stable territorial unit. Hezbollah or the Houthi movement have access to territorial bases that are fairly stable and fairly protected. The Islamic State enjoyed that for a time as well, which comes back to the administrative structure that I discussed earlier. You can establish that kind of structure with a stable procurement chain, drone schools, and modification arsenals if you have access to a stable territory. That is not the case for some other of these groups. And finally, having to do with this, with the presence of territory, one argument that is worth bringing up relates specifically to Hezbollah. There's been an argument made by Al-Alousi that Hezbollah pursues in general, pursuing in all its activities, a deterrence strategy, that they are trying to convince Israel that Israel cannot actually attack Hezbollah because they would suffer they would suffer heavy losses. What we see here is that drone use by Hezbollah fits in that general strategy as well, and that has to do with the protection of this sort of territory. Therefore, that relates very well to the second part, the second argument that I want to discuss now, which is how these groups use it. But if that works, yes, thank you. But the way that these groups will employ drones also relates to the structure of organization and the structure of development. Coming back to this typology that Yannick presented earlier, these are the general ways that Rasler and others have suggested that groups would try to use drones. What I want to do now is insist on the four that we see the most saliently, again, discussing groups and drone programs. And we're not trying to discuss all types of drone use, but specifically these 5 programs. So the 5 we see most often are here on the screen. So that's reconnaissance, propaganda production, and then 2 types of weaponization. That is pilot to target and explosive delivery, dropping munitions. So in the case of weaponization, the first, one of the main ones we see, and the one that's perhaps most well known, is explosive delivery. That is, you take a drone, you attach munitions to it, and you drop the munitions. It's generally how, say, the Western or the American drones, the Reapers and the Predator drones work. You attach missiles to it and you drop them. Obviously, this requires a certain level of skill, technical skill, in being able to build a drone that functions. And it requires advanced modification capabilities. That's the type of use that we've seen Islamic State make of their drones almost exclusively. Other groups have tried to do the same as well. Hezbollah has done it with some drones, and the PKK as well. In the case of the Islamic State, they only used explosive delivery, whereas Hezbollah and PKK have used different types of drones. The drones used here vary greatly in size. It goes from the very small quadcopters that ISIS would use, that the Islamic State would use, that can carry a few hundred grams of munitions, to drones that approach a category we call MALE. So that's medium altitude, long endurance drones, similar to, we can think here, you might be familiar, for instance, with the Turkish Bayraktar that was used in Ukraine. So these are drones that approach the size of regular planes and that fly at a few thousand feet up in the air. The second type of weaponized use of drones is pilot to target, employed, among other things, by Houthi forces. These drones, one attaches a explosive charge directly to the drone crashes into the target and explodes. Now, there are several advantages to this. First of all, it's simpler to use, both technically and in terms of piloting skill. Drones in this case can be pre-programmed using GPS to follow a certain pre-programmed route. It's a one-way trip, which means that the drone can carry more explosive and can travel a longer range, since you do not need to factor in returning time. And in some cases also it can be modified to have area effects. The image you see on the right here is from the Houthi attack on a Yemeni army parade in January 2019. Yannick showed a video of that earlier in the presentation. The drone model here, which was reported to be a CASIF 2K, is designed, you can design the explosive charge to explode in the air and rain down shrapnel, which offers area effects, which might be harder to do with the, for instance, 20mm grenades that Islamic State would use. So it allows for a bigger charge and perhaps bigger effects as well. Here we have an example. This is taken from Don Rasler, again, his studies of the Islamic State drone program. And the conflict armament research has also done very extensive work in this type. And so here we see a model of a quadcopter used by Islamic State. As you can see, it is very simple in that they are small, very basic pieces that can be procured easily on the open market. At the same time, the assembly needs a certain level of skill in knowing exactly how to assemble it and how to be able to achieve good, reliable results. And in the case of Islamic State, they were fairly successful in dropping munitions fairly accurately. What we see in a lot of the images is that they would be successful in hitting some targets, some of the time at least. So that requires a certain skill, both in the technical design of the drone and in how to use it. Here, the video we see is from 2017. It's an attack on a stadium in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, which was used as a munition depot, which Islamic State managed to detonate through a drone attack. That's one of the more high-profile attacks the group managed to achieve. In this case, obviously, you need fairly well-equipped drone. It's the kind of target that does not require too much skill to be able to aim precisely, but the fact that they were able to do this still shows a certain level of sophistication. A second type of employment, and this speaks to the propaganda and reconnaissance uses, is in combined operations with other weapon systems. We've been focusing on drones so far in this presentation, but the drones are not employed only on their own, but often are employed in combination with other types of attacks. In the case of the Houthi movement, they have proven very adept at employing drones in combination with cruise missiles and even short-range ballistic missiles. That means that a certain target can be attacked from several directions, from several types of armament at once, which makes it much harder to stop. The Houthi movements have also been using drones to attack the radar array of Patriot defense systems in Saudi Arabia. So by disabling the radars with some drones, then they can achieve long-range penetration long into the territory. And another type of attack we've seen also the Houthi movement do is in cooperation with other groups or militias, notably in Iraq, as mentioned earlier. In September 2019, there was a major attack on the Aramco oil fields in eastern Saudi Arabia. It was eastern, yes. And in this case, the Houthi movement claimed the attack and claimed to have conducted it themselves. Western intelligence and United Nations investigators suggest that that was not the case, that the drones were in fact launched either from Iraq or perhaps from the sea, but not from Yemeni territory. So that would suggest a cooperation with other groups. There was another attack in January 2021 where drones crashed into the Royal Palace in Riyadh. In this case, Saudi Arabia accused the Houthis of launching these attacks, but it appears the Houthis claimed that it was in fact an affiliated group in Iraq that launched it. So one other advantage of employing drones for long-range attacks is that it allows a certain level of deniability, or at least of confusion. In the case of Islamic State, the main combined attack we see has to do with vehicle-borne improvised explosive device attacks, so car bombs largely, or where a driver would ram his car into a target and explode. Islamic State would use drones for two purposes here. First of all, for direction, so the drone can provide reconnaissance and provide instructions to the drivers on how to approach the target and how to attack. It can provide coordination also between several drivers if you want to launch an attack with several means at once. And then in a second stage, it would allow the production of video packages, as we see, or image packages, as we see here on the right, where Islamic State would be able to produce a narrative of the attack showing the driver's martyrdom video, showing the identity of the driver, and then showing several stages of the attack in progress. Islamic State has also used drones to direct artillery fire, in one case that, among others, that killed a US Marine. So as mentioned, we see, if we focus on these two groups here, we see a difference between two types of models. The Houthi movement have used drones largely for long-range attacks, both on Saudi Arabia, but also on the UAE. In their case, they claim that this is done in retribution for the Saudi air campaign in Yemen, and that drones therefore allow them to level the playing field. They receive a lot of their drones from Iran, but more recently also have started using some parts they receive from Iran and then assembling them into homemade drones. So we see here again that they do not rely only on their patron, but also develop their own forces. Just today, in fact, Central Command of the US Armed Forces released a statement saying they had intercepted a shipment of 170 tons of explosives from Iran to Yemen, which would likely have gone into weapons, either drones and drone munitions or missiles that might have been manufactured in Yemen. And the other group, the other program here that we concentrate on, Islamic State, uses drones, or used drones, as we mentioned, to launch strikes and to coordinate other weapons. What we argue also is that they have a significant propaganda aspect to their drone programs. So in previous work, and Yannick and I looked at propaganda outputs from Islamic State using drones, and looking at 500 images, we saw that a lot of them just simply showed IS being able to fly these drones. What we argue with this is that the propaganda here centered on the aerial dimension, that a state controls the airspace, and that therefore, by being able to overfly territory, IS was showing that it effectively controlled this territory and that it allowed the group to put forward a claim to a type of aerial sovereignty. So this propaganda dimension is more or less present in all the groups we discussed, but in the case of IS, it was particularly salient, and it fed into their larger propaganda output, which aimed at showing that the group was a credible state-like actor. So, sorry. Right, and now coming to the, as a way of a conclusion, coming to the last argument, where we compare what we just discussed with the empirical record, with the literature. This is again the typology that we derived from Don Resler's work, showing the predictions or the expected uses of drones by these groups. What we see is that not all of them materialized. In our data set, we see some of them appear, some of them appear a lot, some of them appear only once or twice, and we see some of them that do not. For instance, electronic collection, we have no evidence at all of groups using this. Part of it has to do perhaps with observation bias. Some activities that groups may want to keep secret will tend to be secret or not tend to be unobserved, because that's the point of it. In other cases, it simply is that these groups do not see use at doing it, or that it might not be something that is relevant for their activities. So as mentioned earlier, the main categories we see are reconnaissance, propaganda production, and then weaponization. We've seen a few isolated cases of the other categories as well. The one that I want to emphasize here is weapons of mass destruction delivery. As Yannick mentioned earlier, the case of Shinriko experimenting in delivering a sarin agent using drones made a big splash in the literature. And then after 9/11, there were a lot of worries about groups or terrorists perhaps using drones to fly radioactive or nuclear material. We have simply not seen any actual evidence of that being the case. Islamic State, for instance, did have a chemical weapons program and a drone program ongoing at the same time. What we do not see is any serious evidence that they actively try to integrate the two and try to mount chemical agent diffusion mechanisms onto drones in a serious way. Again, we're looking here at programs, that is how groups try to have sustained engagement with these things. And one case, even if the Shinriko case were an actual attempt at using drones, and as Yannick said, the record is mixed on that, that does not make it a salient threat. So therefore, what we argue is that there is a need to refocus attention, both by academics and policy and security experts, towards the specific threat presented by drone programs. Programs, unlike isolated uses, can lead to an increased scope and volume of attacks, both in a concentrated time, such as Islamic State using a lot of drones in a small territory at once, and also over time. It can mean sustained use over a long period of time, such as with Hezbollah, for instance. It means that these groups that have established drone programs can engage in training and skills development. They can learn new techniques and tactics. So as state and military powers and security apparatuses try to come up with a means to counter drone programs, groups can respond to that and adapt in themselves. It's a learning process, and the fact that there is a program that has dedicated resources for it means that that learning can take place over a long period of time. And finally, also, that means that it is not enough to focus on the threat of drones themselves, but that we need to pay attention to the combination factor, that these weapons can be used in combination with other weapons, such as IS using them in cooperation with VB IEDs or with artillery, or Houthi forces using them with missiles. So that combined threat is particularly salient as well. So where does that leave us? Of course, we try to sketch out some new direction of, sorry, I skipped a slide here, I believe. Did not. Okay. Right. So that leaves us with potential for several new directions of research and potential things we might expect to see. As we said, we need to concentrate on the things that are empirically evidenced instead of looking in general at what predictions might be made. However, we need to concentrate on what potential innovations might come out of this. That means think of seeing new tactics, or what kind of new tactics, new actors might use drones, what new technologies, as we see a lot of the drones at issue here are civilian drones that are modified. So keeping abreast of that technology changes can also inform how groups might be able to evolve. That means that there might be a need for slightly less forecasting in the long range. So for instance, there's a lot of work that has been done on the danger of drone swarms. that is a very high technology potential use, but that we need instead to follow the empirically evidenced use of these groups, and that requires careful attention of how these groups are built, how they try to use drones, and to try to follow how each group innovates and how they try to develop. So that's the main summary of our report. I will now leave it, before I leave it back to Joanna. As mentioned, our report will be sent to all of you as soon as it is completed, as soon as it is formatted and ready for distribution. We want again to thank ICCT for coordinating this webinar and putting together the publication version of the report. We want to thank Mines and the Canadian Department of Defense for the funding. And I will also mention our research assistants, who were all based at ISRA, at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs at the University of Leiden. So that's Yassine El-Gendouzi, Annette Brass, Tyler Greensmith, and Tuche Weiss, who have done a lot of the data collection for this report. So again, thank you for your attention. And now to hand it back to Joanna for the Q&A.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, Yannick and Emil. I know that the report will be an asset for those who work on drones specifically and technological innovations of non-state armed groups more broadly. Your historical timeline and typology are particularly useful. As he said, this is a sneak peek, and you will get a copy of the report in your inbox December 1st if you are attending online, or it will be accessible on our website at www.icct.nl, where we will also be promoting it quite actively on social media. Following this, you should have the access to the report in French as well before Christmas. Now for the Q&A. I already see a few questions coming up, which is great. So I think as chair, I'm going to take the imperative to start with one very, very brief question for the speakers. But based on your cases and the circumstances you identified for the development and success of drone programs, are there specific groups today you believe are most likely to lead the way in terms of drone use and innovation? Following this, I'll open it up to the questions. Please put those in the Q&A. Thank you.
I'll take a first crack at it, and then Yannick can come in if he'd like to. It is hard to, of course, expect which groups might lead the way, as each group has a different pathway of development. Some of the programs that we discuss, or 4 out of 5 of the programs we discuss in this report, are still ongoing. And in the case of, for instance, the Houthi movement, there appears to have been a significant lull or stop to their activities, partly due to a political ceasefire. And now that, of course, can change as the political situation changes as well. This is not only a historical study in that these groups are still active. In the case of Hezbollah, for instance, there have been unconfirmed, but reports by Israeli sources that Hezbollah might be having a significant hidden stockpile of drones. The number of over 2,000 stockpiled drones has been mentioned, that they might try to, in the case of a major conflict, unleash more or less, perhaps not at once, but in a very concentrated time, to try to overwhelm Iron Dome defenses, for instance. Now that is unconfirmed, but it was mentioned recurringly in the Israeli media, so it shows that that is one type of pressing threat that might be coming up. As we see from the war in Ukraine now, though, it seems that drones will more or less pop up wherever there is significant conflict in different ways. I was at a webinar last week organized by the Réseau d'Analyse Stratégique in French, where Ulrike Franke was mentioning that what we see in Ukraine, especially now, is constant innovation, new uses of drones, new ways of doing it. And a lot of it is driven from below. So Ukrainian troops getting their hands on the drones and then just trying something new. But wherever there is a major conflict or major political violence, there is likely to be some involvement of drones. It will not necessarily look the same as the 5 groups here. It might have several similarities with it, but each group is different. Yannick, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, when we conceptualized this project and the report, we decided to focus on the Middle East because it seemed like the main incubator of innovation when it came to non-state actor use of drone, particularly when we first approached D&D with this report in 2020 or so. Now, kind of stepping back and seeing what we're seeing now in emerging trends, I would be tempted, if one is a betting man and is interested in prediction, to start looking at other kind of incubators of innovation when it comes to drone use. So as Emil mentioned, the Ukrainian conflict is definitely one, both when it comes to the kind of on the ground innovation and modification of commercial drones that we're seeing done by Ukrainian forces. So one really interesting example here is the convergence between drone technology and 3D printing technology. So while the Islamic State had been rumored to use 3D printers in the creation of fins for explosive, actually one of the things that we realized is that these fins are not 3D printed. They were mostly plastic mold, whereas what we're seeing in Ukraine is the use of 3D printing in order to create fins and in order to create attachments that can be mounted on commercial drones. So I think that's one of the incubators that should really be looked at. And also, given that there is a huge amount of media product that is coming out of this conflict, both by journalists, by conflict armament observers, by Ukrainian soldiers, it doesn't require a lot of imagination to see how these innovations are going to be diffused elsewhere and might be possibly adopted by groups in the Middle East. The other incubator that I think isn't looked at nearly enough is in Central and South America, particularly DTOs, drug trafficking organizations, Mexican cartels, for example. And there's some work being done by Robert Bunker, for example, on this. But this is probably the other place that if I was interested in seeing how this technology is going to evolve in the next, 2 to 5 years, this is the other area I would start looking at if we were to kind of do a second version of this project, focusing on the innovation that's happening in that region.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got a lot of questions from the audience here, so in order to try and get through them, I will request that you try and keep your responses concise here as well. I think just based on what you were speaking about, the first question that's really related to that and extends off that is from Mark Tyrell, who asks, given that Iran is supplying Russia with drones and trainers, do you believe that they will also send lessons learned information to their clients?
Thank you, Mark, for that great question. We don't really know. There are reports, of course, as you mentioned, I believe, that Iran has sent personnel to Russia as well, along with the drones. How much and what exactly they do and whether that is actually the case and whether they're still there is still very fuzzy, as in everything that has to do with the conflict in Ukraine. One thing that we found very quite interesting, and this is a hypothesis that we don't have too much evidence for at this point, but that is still likely, we think, is that Iran has been developing a major drone production industry, building their own models and trying to perhaps sell them as they do with Russia. Now, the role that non-state actors might play in that chain is providing a more or less a laboratory for battle testing. So we've seen some of the models that have now been exported to Russia, and also other similar models drones have been used by Hezbollah and by the Houthi movement in particular. Therefore, what that suggests is that that provides a certain a certain potential for lessons learned, seeing how these drones function against, for instance, in the case of the Houthi movement, they are confronted with American radars, American Patriot batteries operated by Saudi Arabia, and so on. So it allows for a certain level of battle testing. In Syria, you had Hezbollah forces using drones fighting alongside Iranian troops and Iranian officers, and sometimes, of course, Russia was involved in that conflict as well. So there is a potential for lessons learned, yes, for learning new tactics and techniques, but also for providing a certain level of proof of concept. These drones work in these conditions because you've seen it used in conflict. And of course, if you're trying to build up an armament export industry, that is a valuable thing to have.
Great. Unless Yannick wants to add anything, then I will move to the next question here.
No,
So Sure. So the next question comes from Helen Kennedy, who asks, are you able to speak to the future of drone use in international law and how non-state actor use may or may not undermine potential treaties on permissive drone use?
Should I take a crack at that one as well? One of the major challenges there appears to be the regulation of dual-use technologies. That has been brought up several times by the United Nations panel of experts on Yemen that has been releasing annual reports, and where drone use and weapons development has been a constant feature. Several of the drones we discuss here are more or less commercial models, the same drones that you might be able to buy on Alibaba or on Amazon or at your local store in Europe, the United States, or the Middle East or China or anywhere in the world. These models of drones are available. They're available for recreational purposes. Sometimes they'll be used by photographers. A drone has to fly and have a camera. Well, of course, photographers like that. Survey experts use that as well. And these are civilian technologies, but that can be, with the right skills, modified very easily. So one thing that the UN panel of experts raises always is, how do you regulate these technologies, and how do you prevent their exports to situations where they can become used in violent attacks? There have been reports of technologies being traced, for instance, technology used by the PKK being traced to Canadian firms. There have been reports of parts for drones being traced to Germany, to other countries in Europe, to the United States. As mentioned, Hezbollah operatives buying drones for Hezbollah were arrested in the United States. As long as these are dual-use technologies, they're very hard to regulate, and their status under international law is somewhat unclear. The same with, as mentioned, the Houthis now try to build their own drone fuselages, sort of airframes, and then add pieces on them that might be pieces from other planes and so on. That's very hard to regulate. So I would think that one of the main challenges for international law there has to do with how to prevent exports and how to control those exports to make it harder for these groups perhaps to build drones.
Great, thank you. So we have an anonymous attendee here who thanks you for your excellent presentation. They've asked two questions. I'm only going to ask the first in consideration of time here. But the first is, are the operational priorities in which terrorists are using UAVs changing at all? Is there an increase in scope, range, and ambitions of targeting?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer to it. So I'm going to defer to Emil on that one. The one change that I'm seeing across the 5 groups is that the barrier to entry has been lowered significantly. A great deal of these groups are, I would say, advocating or at the very least disseminating propaganda, explaining how they're using this technology, how they go about utilizing it, how they're modifying it. And therefore, the learning curve that it takes for another group to adopt this technology is definitely being lowered. So essentially, in many ways, the hard work has been done by these groups. So I'm not exactly sure kind of like what the how these particular groups are going to employ drone technology in the future, but my prediction is that this technology and this violent use of commercial drone is only going to continue being diffused both in the Middle East but in other conflicts as such.
Yeah, building on that, there's two things I would mention. The first one is, as Yannick says, it is ever easier to employ drones, especially in certain categories, especially if you're not trying to weaponize them. For instance, you're using them for observation. You can, that is fairly easy to do. The fact that groups have access to drones and can use them does not mean that they will use them, however. In earlier work that was published in the spring, Yannick and I looked, for instance, with Chelsea Damon from American University, we looked at why right-wing extremists have not employed drones. And what we established is they had access to the material, they had access to the drones themselves, they had access to a lot of material from Islamic State, for instance, that put out a lot of content online on how to use drones. They had access to all that, and still they don't really use it on a large scale, simply because for their group, it does not make sense. So we have to always consider use in context of what a group is trying to do, what other means are available, and so on. As to how uses have changed, with many of these groups, we see sort of a dual track approach, so that there is the sort of, I don't want to say every day, but there is a sort of low scale routine use. We can think of Hezbollah routinely sending drones across the border, or attempting to send drones across the border into Israel. That can be to conduct some reconnaissance, to try to observe changes, or to part of it might be for propaganda purposes, just show that they can do it. Part of it can be to gain information on testing defenses, for instance. But that is fairly routine use, and that happens on a fairly regular basis. And then once in a while, you see groups launching major attacks. In the case of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General, mentioned in his speech, for instance, that we're very interested in the Dimona nuclear reactor. Well, I think it was months or a year or two later, a drone actually flew near that reactor, which was a major incursion into Israel and approaching a very critical target. With the Houthi forces in 2019, there were two major attacks, not back to back, they were 9 months apart, but the attack on the army parade in January 2019, and then in September 2019, a major attack on oil fields that knocked out about half the production of Saudi Arabia for a few days. So we see groups sort of doing both things in parallel, launching regular attacks or regular incursions, but also attempting to launch major attacks once in a while. And now those are much rarer, and they don't define the whole threat, but we do see groups sometimes, well, in American parlance, you would say, hitting for the fences, trying to go for the big result that might, if it works, it's a big coup for them. But those are quite rare as well.
Okay, we have 15 minutes left and 6 questions, so I will cut off the Q&A for now and try and get through the last questions here. So the next question is from Rob Hunter Perkins. How do you recommend that states balance forward-looking threat analysis with the need to be based in empirical evidence? So for example, if we have swarm analysis, which may not be a realistic threat for now, how can this compare to lower tech risks that are more realistic? But should we be focusing more on technological innovations on the near horizon here? Are those technological innovations closer to the horizon than we currently expect? Thank you.
All right, so I'm gonna take a crack at that question. I think it's a really good question, and I think there's a delicate balance to be had. I think it is important not to only confine ourselves in threat analysis, which is based on the current manifestation of the threat today. That being said, one of the things we have seen in this report is that a great deal of effort and a great deal of the discussions about how these technologies are being used don't actually match up any of the realities on the ground. Now, if you're looking for like a practical recommendation here, one of the arguments I make in my book, How Terror Evolves, is that if you're interested in understanding how terrorist groups are going to use emerging technologies, there's really two groups that are really worth taking a look at. The first one is criminal actors. So we're talking here about drones being used to drop explosives as a fairly new phenomenon, something that we've seen in the last 10 years or so. But if you actually step back, you can realize that criminal actors have been using remote control helicopters and so on to drop, guns and weapons and drugs and pornography into prisons for the last 20, 30 years. So looking at how criminals are using an emerging technology, I think is a very good place to imagine how, like, the nefarious dual use of this technology. The second place that I think is really worth looking at is how hobbyists are using this technology. So these are people that are not like politically minded individuals, but are just, are geeks that are really interested in a particular technology. And they're usually a very good barometer at telling us what is technically possible to do with this technology. So, for example, we haven't seen any cases of any non-state actors using weapon-mounted system on their drones, but we do know that this is possible. And the reason we know this is possible is that there's a bunch of YouTubers that have spent a considerable amount of time, shaping and merging, pistols and flamethrowers onto commercial drones. So if you're looking at forecasting, these are the two groups I would counsel you to start looking at. And the way to do this is by doing the type of incident-based databases on these actors. So what are all the ways that criminals are using drones? What are all the ways that hobbyists are using drones? That's a fairly good way to forecast how technology is going to be used. And that goes for 3D printing, AI, chatbots, and so on and so on and so on. But fantastic question.
I might just very quickly here, I might be slight point of disagreement with Yannick here. I'm a bit less optimistic on weapon mounts, for instance. So it's important to look at hobbyists to know what is theoretically possible. But in looking at what groups will do, it's important to understand what they are trying to do strategically with them as well. The fact that we have not seen any groups use weapon mounts perhaps has to do with the fact that it does not make sense strategically for these groups. And partly because if you have access to a large number of drones, why bother mounting a flamethrower on it when you can use it as a pilot to target explosive? But that depends. Understanding what groups are trying to do strategically, what their objectives are, might give a good hint of what they might be hoping to do with drones as well.
I think I've accidentally tucked away Andre Barbaros's question here, so I'm going to ask on behalf of him, does the embargo or sanctions on chips have an influence on drone tech development and or use? And they thank you again for an exquisite presentation.
Very quickly, I would imagine yes, as with all technological products. At the same time, drones are not necessarily very high technology products. So of course they use chips, and there is information technology in there, and any sort of shortage with productions will have impact. But we're not talking IBM supercomputers here. We're talking, some of them can be very simple machines. Most of them, in fact, we're not necessarily talking about a very high-end technology products. A lot of these groups are manufacturing themselves from pieces. So again, we're not talking about something that's very complex. So yes, shortages will have some impact. We haven't really quantified that in any specific way, but yeah, they don't necessarily require access to very high-end products either. So any impact will likely be fairly limited.
The next question is from Valentin Uriart. What is currently being done to fight these drone programs?
So in the report, we talk about various kind of countermeasures that exist, and these range from kind of kinetic solutions, sometimes kinetic solutions that are quite disproportionate. So we have, for example, we have an example of the U.S. allies using a Patriot missile to down a commercial drone. So we're talking about a missile which costs hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, used against a couple hundreds of dollar piece of technology. It's not necessarily the most cost-effective ways. Israel is the same example, right? You're using the Iron Dome system to bring down these drones, not a cost-effective matter, and probably not something that can be sustained in the very long term. There's also an increased amount of technological solutions that are coming out, things like jammers, but also acoustic and video detectors in order to be able to identify these drones as quickly as possible. And then the other kind of possible solutions out there that we're seeing is this notion of like design against crime. So essentially working closely with manufacturer of these drones in order to kind of proof them against misuse. Now, that's never a bulletproof solution, but what it can do is it can increase the barrier to access. And I think this is kind of what I think this is probably one of the most promising avenues, but that requires like a clear buy-in from states to work with these manufacturers. And I think one of the things that's difficult here is out of our data set, the most popular drone models are created by DJI, a Chinese company, which has a fairly strenuous relationship with American lawmakers. But that would be, for me, I think one of the places to go is get buy-in from manufacturers as much as possible.
Another possible solution as well will be tactical or strategic, security forces or militaries fighting against groups that use drones on a sustained basis will have to adapt tactics, procedures, and so on, and be mindful of that threat. So it's always risky to say that knowledge saves, or that knowing about something or understanding it will allow you to combat it. But in this case, I think it's simply that forces have to think about this threat constantly, not only what the drones themselves can do, but how drones can combine with other weapons and adapt tactics to fight that. Very quickly, another option that has been used by Israel, among other things, is targeted assassination, which is legally problematic and can perhaps not scale that well. But Israel has eliminated or killed several Hamas operatives, both in Palestinian territories and abroad, that were involved in drone programs. That works. All these things work to a certain level or to a certain extent. None of these are foolproof solutions, and technology will get better, but there's always as we mentioned earlier, there's a learning and adapting a game on both sides. And that's something that is very difficult to counter.
Great, thank you. The next two questions are actually focusing on the threat or lack of incidence of drones in the West. So I'm going to combine these two questions a little bit here. So first, in terms of drone attacks to Western countries, would there be a greater propaganda value to having attacks in the West from drones? And why haven't we seen more drone attacks in the West? So, for example, has it been easier to pursue other types of methods, such as bladed weapons, vehicles, and so forth? Are governments in the West prepared for drone attacks in the case that they were to come? Please.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's important to kind of preface here is that while these groups have not used kind of weaponized drones in Western settings, we have seen drones being used in very disruptive fashion within the West, and sometimes in quite worrying ways. A few years ago, an environmental activist in Japan who was upset with how the Japanese government was dealing with the Fukushima disaster got a small amount of irradiated sand from Fukushima, put it on a drone and flew it onto the prime minister's residence, where it stayed undetected for several days, if not weeks. We've seen cases of people flying drones very close to world leaders. So Angela Merkel, there's very famous pictures of that happening. We've also seen drones being used deliberately to disrupt commercial airline use. We've also seen two things that are quite important is, far-right actors using drones in reconnaissance. So during the Christchurch attack, we know that the perpetrator flew drones over the mosque in preparation for his attack. We know that drones were also used during the Unite the Right rally, and members of the 3%ers tried to deploy drone during January 6th in order to be able to kind of keep a surveillance on what was happening then. So I'd say we haven't seen a kind of like large kinetic attack using drones in the West, but non-state actors are using this technology. The other thing that I think is quite worrying and worth recognizing is some of these groups, particularly the Islamic State, has for many, many years called on Western sympathizers to use weaponized drones as part of attacks on the West. And this has included providing extensive documents on Telegram, for example, of how somebody could weaponize a drone. So we're talking about like step-by-step documents. And we also know that these documents have been shared in far-right and white nationalist chat rooms. So we haven't seen it, but the threat is definitely present. And I also think that the use of this technology, because we're not used to the presence of weaponized drones in the West, I think if a group did an attack like this, it would have a huge illocutionary value. Even if it resulted in minimal damage or loss of life, it would have a large psychological impacts on many people, and I think and it doesn't even need to be violent. Imagine the psychological impact if somebody flew a drone over a Super Bowl and distributed like a white powder. Imagine the mass chaos that would come from that. So we haven't seen it, but I'm not necessarily, I don't see that as comfort, because we know that this technology is of interest to violent non-state actors operating in the West.
Perfect. Emil, anything to add there?
Not really, just as mentioned in the question, I think part of what why we haven't seen it yet is on a sort of sustained use is that groups have tended to prefer other methods. Right-wing extremists, for instance, have used mass shootings instead. When IS launched attacks in France, it was again shooting attacks at the Bataclan and so on, or vehicle ramming attacks, for instance, in Nice. It might just, part of it might be a cost-benefit analysis there, that they feel they have other methods. We don't, as Yannick said, we don't want this to sound as if relaxed. There is no threat, because obviously you'd only need to be proven wrong once about that for it to have serious consequences. But I think that what we're trying to say is that we need to understand both why groups use drones and how they do it, and in the converse. We do that less in this report, but we've done it in other work, trying to look at why do groups not use drones as well, and try to understand those dynamics. But obviously, as Yannick says, it remains a possibility, and technically it's certainly feasible. The other thing that Yannick mentioned also that I would highlight is that drone use does not need to be violent to be effective. You can use drones for observation, filming, reconnaissance, monitoring, and so on, without it being directly violent, but it can still be highly effective.
Yeah. All right, we have 2 questions left, so I'm going to read out both of them and give you 30 seconds each to respond, so we can try and end this on time here. So these are from Marvin and Faith Ilansani. First, how are opponents to these groups responding to the usage of drones by these groups? For example, while some like Israel can use high-end systems like Tamir or Patriot PAC-2, I imagine that other actors, for example, the YPG, do not have access to those kind of high-end capabilities. And second, how have you seen these armed drones making their way into Africa, and particularly with non-state armed actors? So 30 seconds each, please.
So just to answer the first two questions quickly, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And what we're seeing on the ground a great deal is essentially the use of a small arm fire as a way of bringing down those drones. We've seen this with YPJ, but we've also seen American forces on the ground resorting to that, and then with reasonably good efficiency. With regards to the proliferation of armed drones elsewhere, yeah, I mean, Africa is definitely another incubator. I think a lot more research needs to be done on that continent. But we are seeing, I mean, we've seen Boko Haram use weaponized drones. We've seen Al-Shabaab as well. It is widely distributed in the continent as well, just outside the scope of our report, but something we would definitely like to focus on going forward. And I think we have a template now that we can use, a template from the report that we can bring to other regions in order to understand what the threat looks like and the reality on the ground there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So a final, I'm going to say it one more time because it has been a really excellent and informative presentation. So thank you to the speakers for presenting this sneak peek of the report today. We will share the PDF with the executive summary tomorrow with everyone who's attending. And we will have a big announcement on all social media channels when the full version of the report is released December 1st. So keep an eye out for that. For those attending today on the mailing list, you will get it directly. A reminder to improve future live briefings, please help us by completing the very short post-event survey that will pop up on your screen when you leave this briefing. Otherwise, again, thank you to the presenters, to ICCT, and I wish you all a very good evening. Take care.